and welcome back to Book and Page. Let's get back into Richard III. Today's video, oddly enough, all of Act 2, which is a little more, I don't know, short and stout, as it were, than the other acts for this play. So as always, I'll start with a brief summary of what happened in Act 2, and then get into a little more discussion of some specifics. So, Scene 1 of Act 2, the king has made peace among the factions of his court, and everyone's pledging forgiveness and love to each other, and it's all very nice. And everybody's really flowery language time. Buckingham makes a lovely speech. And then Richard comes in, and the king basically says, "Hey look, I've made everybody friends again." And Richard says, "Cool," and also seems to pledge his own forgiveness and love, or at least ask for forgiveness from the groups involved. And everybody's a little like, yay! And then the Queen asks Edward to forgive his other brother, Clarence. And this gets Richard a little angry, because she seems to be mocking a dead body. Whoops, turns out nobody else here seems to be aware that Clarence kicked it by being stabbed several times. And Richard III is very directly like, well, you kinda ordered that, Edward, like, yep. So, our brother's dead. Congratulations. And everything from there goes downhill as Edward mourns the loss of his brother, who is actually a really good brother. He remembers the time where he saved his life. I mean, Clarence saved Edward's life. It'd be a little weird to mourn a brother and remember when he saved Clarence's life, rather than taking it, as it were. But he remembers Clarence saving him, and actually points out that nobody else there asked for Clarence to receive mercy. And that's a fact that Richard reiterates to Buckingham at the end of the scene when everybody else is left. Hold on to that. We've got a team building, and it's not really good. Scene 2, we meet the Duchess of York, who is actually the mother of Edward, Clarence, and Richard. And Clarence's two children. She's weeping. They say, "Is it because our father's dead?" She says no. The kids say, "Yeah, our uncle told us that, like, our Uncle Richard told us that Edward had killed him." And then the Queen comes in because Edward is dead. And everything is just going downhill. So suddenly we have 4 people on stage, all weeping their hearts out for different reasons. 2 kids, 2 grown women, and Richard and Buckingham come in. See, the Duchess of York doesn't really like her remaining son, Richard. And so despite the, like, reassuring words that everything's fine, they're not really sure everything's gonna be fine. In fact, again, the ladies and children go off, and Richard turns to Buckingham. Well, Buckingham actually turns to Richard and says, "We should go see the young prince, Edward's eldest son, who's going to become king, because the Queen's faction is already working on that." And Richard's like, "You got it, man." So we got a team building here. Scene 3, we leave all of the people we've gotten to know and meet some citizens who are talking about the fact that the king is dead, long live the king. And, well, it turns out his eldest son's going to become ruler. They don't really like that because countries ruled by children often don't prosper. But they also really don't like the fact that the uncles on both sides of the son's family have been named protectors. So not just Richard on the father's side, but also the Queen's brothers have also been named protectors. And this is even worse because they hate each other, they're all greedy, none of them actually care about the kingdom, and all of the common folks are deeply concerned. Yay. And finally, scene 4, the Duchess, the Queen, and we've switched out children. We now have Edward's youngest child, are talking to a cardinal about weird subjects, and about how much the child has grown. And the poor kid comments that his Uncle Richard says that people grow slower when they're better people, because weeds grow faster, pretty flowers don't. And the Duchess, who really doesn't like her son, says he grew slow, he's a dick, Don't be like him. Growing fast is good. And then they have a conversation about whether or not the man was born with teeth, because that's normal. And then they get word. Buckingham and Richard have started making power moves. They've imprisoned many nobles and have secured the young prince. And suddenly everybody in the room goes, well, I think we need to flee or die. And the cardinal, who's now aware of how dangerous it is, offers to escort them all to sanctuary. End of scene 2. End of scene 3, end of act 2. Yeah, that's a lot. But surprisingly, it all works out well for a single video, because you're seeing, like, a sequence of events that really is supposed to be more rapid fire. Like, you're not supposed to be just hanging out in each of these scenes for an extended period of time. It's really meant to be like, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. Because you're supposed to hit the end of Act 2 and go, oh God, everything is happening. So you have these 2 scenes at the start, which are more of the inciting incidences. So the very first one, of course, is Edward finding out that Clarence is dead. Because Clarence's death, like I said last video, just because the the character is dead, doesn't mean the character isn't present in the rest of the play. This scene is really obvious, because Edward is just like, what have I done? And everybody else is just sort of like, oh no. Because precisely what was achieved before we entered that scene, so this forgiveness moment and this reconciliation between these 2 factions at court, the Queen's faction and we'll say kind of Richard's faction. Buckingham is certainly siding with Richard past this point, are making amends. But the moment Clarence's death is actually announced here, all of that is scrapped. Like, no one looks at each other really and says, well, that was meaningless. On to killing each other then? Right. It's not directly said that way, but there's certainly hints to it. I mean, Richard, for the most part, is more verbal about it. Because he pokes at Buckingham at the end of the scene. Everybody else leaves, and he's just like, did you see the Queen's faction? Like, literally, they got my brother killed. And Buckingham's a little like, think you might be right. Think you might be right. Which is why, when you study Richard as, like, a very charismatic person, he knows how to play the game. Because this sort of step down where he humbles himself at the very beginning of this act, he knows precisely it is not going to matter. Some point during this conversation, he's going to drop the bomb that Clarence is dead, and everything that's been said prior to this point is thrown out the window. So, it seems a bit surprising when he comes into the scene and Edward's sort of like, look, we're all making friends, and Richard's just like, sure, I want to make friends too. But that's precisely how aware he is currently in control of things. Because he knows that I can say these really nice things right now, and everyone will be less suspicious of me when I drop Clarence is dead, and then all of us can go back to scrapping. Because truth be told, Richard is not trying to reassure the other faction. He is not trying to reassure the Queen that his actions are noble. He's actually trying to consolidate his own faction, particularly Buckingham. Because Buckingham was the one who received the direct warning in the last act from Margaret, the previous queen, that Richard could not be trusted. So, Richard actually entering the scene here, and without prompting from Edward beyond, hey, we're all making friends, he speaks and says, yes, I want to ask everyone's forgiveness. We're in peacetime now, we can let all these old grudges go. Because that isn't for the Queen. It's a question of what audiences Richard is speaking to. And it's not to us. We already know that Richard is the bad guy here. And the Queen and her faction aren't going to trust him beyond this point, simply because he is also going to be in power should Edward die. So, Richard is picking his audience, and his audience right now is Buckingham, and he gets Buckingham hook, line, and sinker. Because most of these scenes, except really the citizens in the middle, most of these scenes revolve around Richard and Buckingham's actions. They're all framed in different ways, but those two people become sort of the main pair in this act. Because Richard comes in, but he and Buckingham are the last to leave the scene. The same is true with the second scene. When they come in together, they remain afterwards and leave together again. And they're acting in that fourth scene, and it's their prompting, their actions that prompt the actions of the Queen and the Duchess and the children at that point. So it's this really interesting fact that Richard knows how to play these people well enough that he knows the important people to play off of right now. And it's not Edward. Edward is ill, and the shock of, yeah, you killed your brother, is probably going to help do him off. And it's not the Queen and her faction. He's precisely playing to Buckingham. Because he's actually one of the few people Richard speaks directly to as this act goes on, and repeatedly comes back to Buckingham. To the point where he actually lets Buckingham seem to be in control at the end of scene 2, where Buckingham suggests we should go to the prince. And Richard just appears to agree with that. No, again, that's precisely Richard's plan, but he knows how to play people well enough to get Buckingham to agree with him. It's really interesting. If Richard didn't want to be the villain, he honestly could be a very good advisor and stay in power if it wasn't for the, I want to be fully in power. Like, if he was willing to stay in the shadows, he could pull a lot of strings. And that's one of the faults of Richard that we need to start paying attention to. Because we know he's smart, we know he knows how to play to his audience and pick his audience, but he starts giving himself away in really weird moments. His own mother, for example, we find out in this scene, severely distrusts Richard. Like, she hears from both Clarence's children and Edward's children that Richard has sought them out and had conversations with them, and tries to appear like that adult that's helping them and keeping them informed. He, again, knows what audiences to pick and how to speak to them. But the fact that his own mother distrusts him is going to start becoming like an obvious flag for a lot of other people. Even his nephew, Clarence's son, turns to his grandmother and says, "Do you think he's dissembling?" And she says, "Yes." And that should be a clue. Like, if your own mother is just like, "Yeah, no, this person is a bad person," like, that starts giving you hints. But it's also a question of how much you trust the Duchess of York as a character. Maybe she's always treated him poorly because he does have a disfigurement. Well, then you don't really trust her, and you're more likely to trust Richard because she's just being mean because of something he can't control. So it's this really weird tension where the younger generations seem to want to trust Richard, but other points and other parental figures are saying, like, no, and they need to start thinking about those as well. But Richard has done a very good job of sort of undercutting a lot of the foundations this family remains on by going after the younger generations. His full plan, for the most part, is to take out the older generations and his own generation. And he runs into the point where he takes out younger generations too. And that's the moment we start seeing him overstepping his boundaries. He's trying to fight too many people at once with not enough allies. But we're not really getting that sense in this act right now. We can start seeing hints of it, surely, but Richard seems to actually be winning in Act 2, because he's got Buckingham with him. They've obviously got enough power, they've thrown several nobles into jail and have secured the prince, and he does seem to have the younger generation listening to him more. He is effectively doing well at this point in time. And what clues us into that is precisely that odd scene in the middle of the citizens. Just like in Greek theater, the chorus is meant to be a pulse point for the audience, citizen moments are supposed to be a historic pulse point for the audience. How are the everyday average people viewing this right now? And that helps sort of the audience step back, because we're well aware of things. We're well aware, like Richard told us from the beginning, he's playing the villain. But the local citizens don't know that. He's proved to be charismatic, knows his audience, and he seems to be playing some of the common people just as much as he's playing some of the nobles. Because they distrust having a boy as a king, and they distrust splitting the rule between the two sides of the family. What one of the citizens specifically says is better if it had just come from the king's side or none at all. And the king's side, they know, is Gloucester at this point in time. They know it's Richard, Duke of Gloucester. They say that specifically. And they recognize he's dangerous, but they have a preference for Richard alone as protector rather than Richard having to deal with the brothers of the Queen. And that gives us a sense that Richard is precisely playing the long game here when it comes to the citizens supporting him. Because they are thinking, as it is now, this is not good. So if Richard can continue to look like the morally upright person who's trying to do the best thing for the kingdom, the citizens will probably go along with him, because they don't like the setup right now. They don't like power split between two sets of uncles with a boy king. So what's actually happened in this entire act is these inciting incidents, and then we have the citizens come in and say, yeah, we don't like this either, but we'd probably lean towards Richard's side at the moment. And that should be like a big warning, because even the cardinal in the last scene of the act is almost fooled. And then it's the gentleman coming in and basically being like, nobles have been taken to jail, no reason is given, Buckingham and Richard, everybody run, and the cardinal goes, I see it now. So Richard really does have to start exposing his actions as sort of these underlying, like, slimy actions before people are going to start recognizing and turning against him. But we are starting to see that happen. What's just really interesting is how it's sprinkled with these little bits of information that in a lot of ways actually make you start feeling sorry for Richard. He's got these people who tell stories about him because of his disfigurement. He had a person who claimed to be his wet nurse and said that he had teeth after a day of being born. I mean, like, he was born with teeth. Well, that's not a nice thing to be telling somebody. That is, again, an insult. He's a biter. And the idea is that the wet nurse knows this because he bit her. But he would have been a baby if that were true. And the Duchess seems to say, no, it's not. He got teeth at the age of 2. So how much of Richard is literally him saying, nobody ever chose my side, so I'm going to choose my side and take everybody else out? And how much of that can we start understanding from his perspective? But how much of that is a false myth used to justify Richard here? Like, that's the really interesting thing, is we're starting to peel back the layers on Richard and finding he seems to be telling more and more stories that are falling apart fairly quickly. And we're going to get to the point where Richard can't hold everything together because his stories just get far too wild. And we'll see this especially with the princes in the tower. But Act 2, Richard is winning. The citizens seem to be siding more with him. He's won Buckingham as a partner in crime at this point in time. His brothers are out of the way, and effectively most of the women are either kind of nuts, have fled, or we'll also meet Anne again and how she's doing in this terrible circumstance. So, with that said, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.